and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 10 worst things that the Star Trek franchise has ever done. In this video, I will list off, in my opinion, the 10 worst things the Star Trek franchise has ever done. Pretty simple. Now, of course, this is all just my opinion. As I said, it's what I believe. It's what bothers me most about Star Trek when I go back and watch it. It's the things that I wish they would have done differently or not done at all, as the case may be. It's the things that sort of stand out to me as, the things I could do without in my Star Trek. Now, I was thinking when I was making this list, should I go more general or be more specific like that, nail it down to very specific things? And I ended up doing a combination of both, because I found that if I stuck to specific things, I couldn't really come up with 10 things that really irked me, and there's more general things too that I wanted to include because it's what bothers me. So it's basically the things that bother me most about Star Trek, whether they be specific things or general things. And I try to rank them from worst to best. Now, if you are familiar with my channel, some of these, you may be able to predict some of these things that are going to be on my list because I ranted about them constantly on my channel. And I will give a honorable mention before I start my list to the series finale of Voyager, ending Voyager so terribly. Those familiar with my channel might expect that to be on my list, but I feel like I've ranted about that enough. And plus, this list is different than my 10 worst episodes list, although some of those worst episodes are touched on, but not really. I actually this list is actually different than that worst episode list. So I feel like the Endgame series finale, I know people will expect it, because that's one of the things that really irks me about the Star Trek franchise, is particularly Voyager, is the way they ended it. But I feel like that is a specific episode, so that's more appropriate for my top 10 worst episode list, which, if you're not aware, I did actually a series of videos where I did a full-length review of each of the 10 episodes in my worst episode list of the entire Star Trek franchise, and I have like a playlist on my channel. If you're interested, if you haven't seen it, you can watch that. And Endgame, I believe, was like number 7, which surprised people because it's usually it's my number 1 worst Voyager episode. That's for sure, and I think it's the worst series finale of all time, and it was number 1 worst in my series finales of all time list. But anyway, so that's kind of just, I thought I should mention that up at the top. So let me go ahead and get into the 10 worst things that the Star Trek franchise has ever done. I'll start with my number 10. Tom Paris and Janeway turn into salamanders. Now, I thought I should include this because I didn't include the episode Threshold in my top 10 worst episode list, which surprised a lot of people because many people would consider that one of the worst episodes Star Trek has ever done, and it's very infamous for being one of the worst episodes of Star Trek. But here's the thing, I don't think, up until that ending, I don't think the episode's that terrible. Now, it's not good, that's for sure, and the whole concept is ridiculous, but mostly it's just kind of a boring standard episode where Tom Paris is turning into a monster and he's shouting about pepperoni pizza or whatnot, and it doesn't really get into the realm of what in the hell until you get to that ending. So that's why I felt like the need to specifically call out the ending rather than the episode as a whole, because I think the episode as a whole is not really as terrible as a lot of people, although it is in my top 10 worst Voyager list. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it's a good episode by any stretch of the imagination, but the worst thing about that episode is definitely that ending, where if you're not familiar, if you haven't heard of it, Tom Paris breaks the warp 10 barrier and he de-evolves, or evolves actually. He evolves into a higher being, and he takes Janeway with him and captures her at the end, and they both evolve together, and they evolve into these salamander creatures that have babies that they just leave on the planet. It was the weirdest, most unscientific, most ridiculous, like, I want to know what kind of drugs the writers were on when they wrote that. I really would like to know. They were definitely doing some really hard shit. Yeah, so, I mean, I feel like I should have included that on my worst, that I should include it on this worst list, even though, like, I find it more funny, but it is definitely one of the worst things Star Trek has ever done. So anyway, let me get into number 9 on my list of the worst things the Star Trek franchise has ever done, and that is preventing romantic couplings that made sense for the story. Now, this is a general thing because I could apply it to one couple, but then I thought, I have a couple examples, but the two strongest examples I have are Beverly and Picard, or, not Beverly, Beverly Crusher and Jean-Luc Picard, and the Doctor in 7 of 9. In both cases, the writers wanted to push these as a couple, and in both cases they were overruled by the producers, Rick Berman, and prevented from doing so, even though it made sense for the story. Now, I did a whole sort of video about my favorite romantic couples and my least favorite in Star Trek. And I believe, like, my favorite personally, now I know everyone has different opinions on this, but my favorite's usually in Deep Space Nine, because I think in that show, the writers were able to evolve relationships naturally, and they could see if chemistry worked between two actors or two characters. I think, like, particularly Worf and Dax, because they could see they didn't intend to make them get married, but they could see the chemistry between them. Odo and Kira had a really strong chemistry that they, I believe, naturally build off of, although a lot of people disagree with that one, but I find a lot of supporters in that as well. And Ezri and Julian Bashir, I will die on that hill. Apparently a lot of people hated that. I will die on that hill, but I do have some supporters in that as well. They make so much sense together. But anyway, Voyager is like the opposite, though. Voyager is like every couple they did, I think, should have been a different couple. Like, they put B'Elanna and Tom Paris together, which I think it should have been B'Elanna and Harry Kim. I think that was more natural for the story. That made a lot more sense. And don't even get me started in the whole Chakotay 709 thing. Just don't. And then over Next Generation, there's the whole Worf and Troy thing that teased with that. That was stupid as well. Sorry. I did not like that. And here's the thing. Here's my main point, though. Is that couples in Star Trek should come out of naturally occurring chemistry that's already there, as I mentioned. Whereas I feel like stuff like the Tom and B'Elanna thing, they were kind of just decreed they should be together, and then they started building towards it instead of building off of something, because no chemistry existed between them before they decreed and they started building up toward it. And of course the whole 709 Chakotay thing, that was definitely producers say, hey, let's put these two characters together and give Chakotay something to do, and there was zero chemistry. It really didn't work. Whereas, okay, let me focus on our main two, Beverly Crusher and Picard. I'm speaking specifically of the episode Attached in the 7th season, because they kind of toyed with them having a sort of feelings for each other in season 1, and it was kind of abandoned after season 1 when Crusher returned in season 3. But they started toying with it a little bit. Every once in a while, like Allegiance, they toyed with it. That was in season 3, and a couple episodes here and there. But in the 7th season episode Attached, they really addressed it head on, where the two of them confessed their feelings for each other, and because they were connected telepathically, they could actually feel the feelings that they had for each other. And the episode was originally intended to end with them hooking up, but the producers overruled it because they wanted Jean-Luc Picard to be single for the movies, so he could have a romance in the movies. And how did that pay off? Okay, he didn't have a romance in Generations, nor in First Contact, nor in Nemesis. The only movie he had a romance in was Insurrection, and that romance of the week was terrible. And that wasn't a very good movie, and I didn't feel any chemistry between them, and it was forgettable, so it was a waste. They should have just put Jean-Luc and Beverly together. And, in all good things, they implied, like, in this future they had been married and then divorced. But in Star Trek Picard, still no mention of Jean-Luc and Beverly being together. So they should have done that in Attached. Therefore, any future projects would have to address it. And then the other one is The Doctor in 7 of 9, the episode, which I'm about to review in a couple of weeks, called Someone to Watch Over Me. It was a brilliant episode. Now, this was, again, natural occurring chemistry between these two characters, because they had this sort of mentor relationship thing, but you could tell that there was sort of a bit more, and they made a very interesting couple. And the episode Someone to Watch Over Me was a strong argument as to why those two should have been together, because it was about the Doctor trying to find 7 of 9 a date, and then the moral of the whole time, of course, the Doctor was finding he was enamored with 7 of 9 himself, so the whole moral was that the love interest for her was standing right there in front of her the whole time, and that would have been the perfect ending to that episode, and actually would have been a really great relationship going forward in the series. It would have been very interesting, and they could have had a lot of unique and interesting stories to come out of that, but again, they were overruled by the producers. The ending of Someone to Watch Over Me was originally intended to be the Doctor confessing his feelings to 7 of 9, but the producers were like, no, we don't want that, and so they made it just be the Doctor talking to a holographic version of her on the holodeck. When he saw the real life version of her, he was too chicken shit to mention it, which I think ruined the episode, and it made no sense. Unlike the Picard situation, in this case, I got no idea why the producers were against it. It made no sense. Instead, they wanted to create couples together like the Chakotay 7 of 9, which was bullshit, instead of going off of what natural chemistry that occurs naturally on screen. But whatever. So, that is one of the worst things about the Star Trek franchise, in my opinion. Then we get to number 8 on my list. And that's making the Klingons adversaries again. This is in Deep Space Nine Season 4. And again, this is something probably a lot of people disagree with me on. Because some people will hold up Season 4 and 5 as some of the best seasons of Deep Space Nine. I think they're good seasons, don't get me wrong. They have some of my favorite episodes in it. But particularly Season 4, I think, is a bit stronger. But I think making the Klingons adversaries again was a terrible idea, and I think it actually puts a damper in those seasons, which is why I prefer Season 3 of Deep Space Nine, and I prefer Season 6, and even Season 7. Because I think it was the totally wrong thing to do. It was done for a marketing ploy, basically, rather than anything that felt natural for the story. The show of Deep Space Nine, I'm not opposed to bringing the Klingons and making them a more important race on Deep Space Nine. In fact, they really made that work in Season 6 and in Season 7 by them being allies. By them having a Klingon station aboard Deep Space Nine, General Martok with his own Klingon ship, and every once in a while Worf would go off on the ship and they'd have an whole episode devoted. That worked. But having them be enemies, that did not work. That was, they even moved past that the Klingons being enemies in the Star Trek franchise. That worked for the original series, but the Klingons made a name for themselves and were sort of in the hearts of fans as being the uneasy allies, which worked in Next Generation, and that's how they should have remained. Now, in the midway through season 5 of Deep Space Nine, they realized this and they sort of course corrected it and made them allies again, as I said, because they realized that they worked better as allies, and indeed they did going forward in the series of Deep Space Nine. But then it becomes kind of inconsistent. It doesn't make sense storytelling wise, because you had a war break out between these two races that there were allies, and then a year later they're warring, and then a year later they're allies again, like the strongest of allies ever, who are fighting together in a war against Dominion. And that's really inconsistent and doesn't make any sense. They never should have been enemies in the first place. The episode The Way of the Warrior, which, to be fair, a lot of people love more than I do. I think it's just okay. You could have had that episode, but have it be standalone. Had that be like sort of a one-off sort of conflict between Starfleet and the Klingons, and then they kind of make up and go back to being uneasy allies. Maybe it puts more of a strain on their alliance. That would be interesting. But not outright enemies, and then, we're breaking away from the core. And it seemed really sudden and contrived the way they broke off from the alliance, too. So, I gotta say, that was a huge mistake, and that's one of the things I think is the worst thing the Star Trek franchise has ever done. Alright, so let me get into my number 7, which is having reoccurring Ferengi episodes on Deep Space Nine. Now, again, I kind of went specific and pinpointed Prophet and Lace, but again, that was on my worst episode list, the top of it. So I feel like I've already sort of talked about that episode specifically, but the whole concept of having 2 or 3 Ferengi episodes per season that focused on Quark going off with all these other Ferengis and having the whole FCA, and I don't know. Apparently there are some people out there that exist that like this, and I had gotten a few comments from some of them saying, I like Ferengi episodes. But I think the vast majority of people, everyone I knew personally anyway, every time a Ferengi episode would be previewed for the next week, we were like, Ferengi episode, might as well just skip it. And pretty much everyone I know feels like that way. That if you're watching it on reruns or watching it on Netflix, or you skip over the Ferengi episodes because they really stand out. They try to be really comedic, and most of them are not. There's one glaring exception, which is my favorite comedy episode of the whole Star Trek franchise, Magnificent Ferengi. But that one episode does not justify the existence of this recurring storyline. I don't give a fuck about the FCA. I don't care about Brunt. I don't care about Moogie or Quark's mother or the Nagus going off and being a dick. Every time at best, it's okay. In the first couple of seasons, I thought I was tolerated. The Nagus, I tolerate that. The one with the Pell, the Ferengi woman pretending to be a man, that's interesting. I tolerate that. The one where the Nagus is rewritten by the prophets to be the nice guy ever, I actually kind of like that. I thought that was funny, so I tolerate that. But in the later seasons, as soon as they introduced Quark's mother, and they had this storyline with Brunt taking away Quark's license, and Brunt is the main thing I didn't like. And then as soon as they got into all that and him trying to take over, I don't give a fuck. It's not good storytelling. It's not even that great comedy. Deep Space Nine is not a comedy show. And I've heard this opinion too, is that comedy in Star Trek in general is not good. Star Trek is not a comedy show. It shouldn't try to do comedy. And if, you can have some lighthearted, funny moments within episodes, but to have an entire episode based on comedy, it's usually not what Star Trek does well. And especially having an entire reoccurring series of episodes based on comedy that's not particularly funny and it features characters that are not likable, not well written, kind of cliched. Except for Quark. You gotta love Quark. That's why I will distinguish Ferengi episodes from Quark episodes, because Quark is actually an interesting character, and some episodes that focus on him, like the one where he was an arms dealer. God, blanking on the name of that episode, but the one where he was an arms dealer in season 5, and the one where he, like, the House of Quark, where he married. That was kind of a comedy episode, but actually worked because Quark is an interesting character. But the ones that just delve into Ferengi society and talking about how the muck and all that, they're just terrible. It was just a bad idea, and it shouldn't have been done. Anyway, let me get into the next entry on my list, number 6, which is making Tilly the first officer. Now, those who hate Discovery might be surprised. This is my only entry of Discovery on my list, because a lot of people will hold up Discovery in general and they hate it. Now, I have mixed feelings about Discovery. Let me put it this way: there's a lot of people who like Discovery more than I do. And there's a lot of people who hate Discovery more than I do. I'm kind of more mixed on it. So nothing of it really stood out and bothered me as much to make this list, except for this one thing. And in fact, this is kind of a surrogate. I could have made this a broad category as well, and included, like, the Star Trek 2009, when Kirk was promoted from cadet to captain. I had railed against that, and this hits at that same category. Honestly, I think this is worse. Alright, so in season 3 of Discovery, if you're not aware, Saru was made the captain because Discovery is like alone in the 32nd century, and they joined Starfleet, but they still are kind of independent. They keep their same crew and everything. And Saru was the captain, and Michael Burnham was made first officer, but she went off and defied orders or whatever, so she was demoted. So in her place, they promoted Ensign Tilly, who, to be honest, I'm a bit unclear if she ever graduated the Starfleet Academy, because sometimes they refer to her as a cadet. But let's, for the sake of argument, assume that she did, and she's an ensign. Why the fuck is she the first officer when there's tons of lieutenant commanders, people with a lot more experience and age, and everyone's okay with it too? Everyone's like, yeah, Tilly, take the position. Yeah, we're okay with you, even though you have way less experience and a much lower rank than us, being our superior. That is one of the most ridiculous. And mind you, remember, I put this higher than the salamanders. So I think this is even more ridiculous and more unbelievable. And it just bothered the hell out of me. And I could never take her seriously. It absolutely it angered me just as much as the Kirk being promoted captain thing. And in some ways I think it's worse. Because in that case, Kirk was being promoted on the ship where everyone else was like also a cadet. But of course that made no sense. But at least he kind of had some superior experience in them, except for Spock. I don't know. But here, there's clear superiors here. There's lieutenant commanders, people who've been in Starfleet longer, people who are definitely more qualified to serve as Saru's first officer. The only reason it's done is because she's a main character and those other people aren't out there. Mainly just background characters we don't really know. So they're like, well, we gotta make this main character. Even though she, in many cases, comes off as really incompetent. And when she was serving as first officer, I couldn't take her seriously, and she was incompetent. I couldn't buy that these people who had older and more experience than her were following her when she hadn't earned it. It's just a virtue of being a main character. It is one of the worst things the Star Trek franchise ever did, and it pissed me off. Anyway, let me go ahead and move over to my number 5 worst thing the Star Trek franchise has ever done, and that is the theme and setting of Enterprise. Now, notice how I didn't call it Star Trek Enterprise, because in the first 2 seasons it was just called Enterprise, because the show was trying to trick viewers into thinking it wasn't a Star Trek show. Now here's the thing. I'm not opposed to having a prequel in the Star Trek franchise. I'm not opposed to having a Star Trek show set in this particular time period. In fact, in season 4 of Enterprise, I think this works extremely well, and they show you how well a Star Trek prequel could work, and how interesting it would be to see a Star Trek show set in this time period and setting the stage for what we would become known as Star Trek. But that's not the original theme and setting that I'm referring to. I'm referring to a theme and setting that, and especially like there was an abandoned idea, which I think actually, unlike other cases where I disagreed with the producers in the studio, in this case I absolutely 100% agree with the studio. In fact, the studio should have never allowed this premise to go to air in the first place. Is that the original premise of Enterprise was it would take place on Earth, and it would be like a hot stuff, the right stuff, that's what it's called, type show where, they're trying to get the space program up and going. But I think the studio is very wise to overrule that, because that sounds even more terrible than what it was. But so the issue I have with the theme and setting is that it's trying to be like realistic astronauts and how they got into space, and even the theme, the opening, I'm not talking about the song yet, but the opening visuals of the opening credits will play off of that, because it shows the history of sort of astronauts and space travel and whatnot. And that's never what Star Trek has been about. Star Trek is not hard fiction. I'm sorry to break it to you. It is so unrealistic. It's only set 300 years in the future, and yet they explored most of the galaxy, and they have ships that can travel faster than light just by turning on an engine called warp, and they meet aliens, and all the aliens just look like humans with shit on their forehead. It's not realistic. It's not. It never was. It is not hard science fiction. It's more speculative. It's more an allegory, commentary, and it's more fantastical, quite frankly, and it's world building, and that's what makes it interesting from that sort of standpoint of world building, of creating this very fictional, very, very fictional universe. And so to have a show that tries to ground it and be like, oh, this is what contemporary real life astronauts would be like if they went into space, it's very antithetical to the whole theme of Star Trek. Moreover, the particular theme of Enterprise, the theme reminds me, and I mention this a lot, it tries to be like a idealized, fictionalized version of the 50s, like the Waltons or something like that. It tries to be like it's supposed to be set 200 years in the future, and yet they all act like they're from the 1950s. They even make this clear when they have movie night, where they, in the future, centuries in the future, they sit down and watch black and white movies from the 40s, 50s, and 60s on the screen. How much sense does that make? That makes absolutely zero sense. But then all the characters, they're all flat. By the way, the cast of characters were not well designed. And they all act like they're from the 50s, and they even have an episode where they go back into the 50s and they have this idealized, stylized version of how great the 50s were, and they just ignore all the racism and other social issues that were around back then. So, yeah, that was the whole concept. Now, later in season 3 and 4, once Rick Berman and Brennan Brager were starting to be slowly pushed out, they actually got away from that, and they made the show good by defying what the original theme and setting of, well, not setting so much, because, as I said, you could do good things with the setting, which they did do in season 3 and 4, and 4 in particular, which played off the whole aspect of it being a prequel. And season 3 and 4 actually started to make some of these really flat, boring characters interesting because they went away from that 1950s archetype that was baked in to the show, that was baked into the first 2 seasons in particular. So that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking. That's why I'm saying the theme and settings of Enterprise. I mean originally, of how it was originally conceived, and that's why I'm not saying the show as a whole, because the show as a whole actually got really good towards the end, and the reason why it got really good is because it defied the original theme. That was a terrible idea. Terrible. Anyway, let me get into my number 4. Fans of my channel should not be shocked at all that this is on my list. Number 4, the introduction of Vic Fontaine. Vic Fontaine. Now, those familiar with my channel know that I despise this character. I cannot stand him. I think introducing him into Deep Space Nine was a terrible idea. Now, granted, he was introduced into Deep Space Nine towards the end of season 6, and there's 7 seasons of Deep Space Nine. So why they felt the need to introduce a character this late in the game, first of all, I think didn't make any sense. Secondly, he was a very obvious stand-in for Guinan, the character who everyone goes to for advice and sort of to build, boost morale and whatnot, which I suppose, the archetype of that type of character is not such a bad idea. Introducing them at the end of the second to last season, that doesn't make as much sense. But here's the thing that bothers me about Vic, is that he's a lounge singer who sings like Frank Sinatra covers and other style cover songs, and they focus on these songs and have him singing them for like 3 or 4 minutes at a time. And in fact, the finale, which I think this is the clear worst aspect of the finale, will make a whole sequence of him singing and then having these cheesy flashback montages over, well, not his singing, more of an orchestral version of it, but still, they glorify his singing. And Star Trek Deep Space Nine is a brilliant show. It's one of my favorite science fiction, if not my favorite science fiction show of all time, because it's a very dark, gritty, intellectual show with really fleshed out characters that deal with hard, like, really a lot of great allegories to modern times, and it really like stretches. It makes you think. It's very intellectual, and it hits at hard issues unforgettingly, and it's just a well-developed thinking man's sci-fi, and it can be very suspenseful, very thoughtful at times. But it's not a fucking variety show. There's no reason why we should be subjected to like 4 or 5 minute bad covers of Frank Sinatra songs in the middle of this great sci-fi show. It doesn't make any sense. And again, not getting into the specific episode Bada Bing Bada Bang, because that was on my worst of the franchise list, so you can get into that. It was the singly most contrived episode of the entire Star Trek franchise. They just went out of their way to defy logic and characters and orders just so they could have this fun heist episode story, which was just a rip-off, a lesser version of better heist stories. He added nothing to this franchise. He made Deep Space Nine's final seasons worse. They would have been better off without him. Screw Vic Fontaine. Anyway, now let me get into my number 3 worst thing the Star Trek franchise has ever done. And this is a more general one. And that's not making Star Trek more serialized, which some people will find a bit ironic, because a lot of people complain about modern Star Trek as it being too serialized. Now, I don't think the fact that Discovery and Picard, or whatever shows they're coming out with future, I don't think the fact that being serialized is the issue. It's the fact that they haven't really mastered doing serialization. They haven't really done it correctly. The fact that it is serialized is actually, I think, a good idea, and it's one of the draws that draws me to that show. Because in general, I think serialization is better for television because it allows more for character development and character growth. And in fact, I believe some of these earlier shows should have been more serialized. Now, the original series was made in the 60s, and that was a different time, different era, and it wasn't the least bit serialized. I think it would have benefited from being more serialized, but it's a 60s show, so you can't see it in that light. Next Generation, I think, is more serialized than people give it credit for. A lot of people point to Next Generation as being episodic, and on the surface, it is, but again, it was made in a different era where serialization wasn't really a thing, but the writers, and you didn't notice the producers did sneak in serialization here and there when they could. Such as the ongoing storyline with Worf being discombobulated by the Klingon Empire. You got reoccurring characters which build off of previous appearances such as Barclay and Q and the Traveler. And you had character growth. You had people who would reference earlier episodes to show how it involved their characters. So I would say that they did sneak in serialization in TNG when they could. Now, Deep Space Nine is very noticeable, being one of the most serialized earlier versions of Star Trek before serialization was still known. In fact, watching the documentary of Deep Space Nine, you find that many of the producers were against this, and a lot of the studio basically told the showrunners that you're killing the show by making it serialized, but thankfully they ignored them. But my main complaint here at this entry on my list mainly has to do with the show Star Trek Voyager. Although it's not the only example, which is why I didn't say it in the title, but which I'll get to later, but it mainly deals with Voyager. I think Voyager was the one most hurt, because the premise of Voyager, where it's a lone ship trapped alone in a distant part of space with no allies, no Starfleet anywhere near, they're like way far away. The whole concept screams serialization. So the writers and the people making the show were leaning in that direction, and it was the studio had to purposely step in and say, no, you can't do that. And in fact, to the point where in later seasons, they actively went out of their way to make the show not serialized. Because here's the thing, some of the earlier seasons got away with a little bit by having some recurring characters, which is why I prefer the earlier seasons, to be honest. You had Hogan and Carrie and some people who would appear every once in a while. But here's the thing, Voyager should have had the same cast of extras, the same cast of characters, because it's an isolated situation. Like, if you have the Enterprise and Next Generation, you can sure some people are transferring, they got new people, but even Next Generation has the same recurring extras. It's got Lieutenant Kellogg, Ensign McKnight, Ensign Rager. You recognize the faces, where Voyager, other than Lieutenant, is he Lieutenant or Ensign? I think he's an Ensign. Other than Ayala, character who appeared in the very first episode of Voyager as a Maquis, and he would be a background character to the very end of Voyager. Other than him, they didn't really have the same cast of background characters. And I think the best example of a show doing this correctly is Stargate Universe, which only existed for 2 seasons, but when I watched that show, I was like, this is what Voyager should have done. Because Universe had a lot of characters who mainly just appeared in the background and didn't do much, and then by the end of the second season, they were almost main characters because they would develop them more, and plus you would see the same basic set of characters over and over again, so it made sense, because that was also about a ship being in a far distant space, being isolated. And so they actually made that work and make sense, and they would build off of these minor characters and develop them more and more and more until they actually became somewhat integral to the plot. And that's what Voyager should have done. And also Voyager should have has some consistency with its journey and the different aliens it encountered, but it has I ranted about in my Voyager reviews, there's absolutely no consistency whatsoever. They seem to they run into aliens in which they should have left their space, like they should be so far away it would take years for them to get there, so it makes no sense. They have no sense of continuity whatsoever, and therefore there's no character growth. The character journeys in Voyager are very botched. The writers clearly didn't know what they wanted to do with Janeway. Her journey is her character arc is very inconsistent throughout the show's run. In fact, I find that in season 5, and this is something I ranted out specifically in season 5 of Voyager, that they tried to rework and rewrite all the characters. So there was no continuous arc, really, except for 7 of 9, but they kind of botched that in later seasons too. And the Doctor, but they kind of went overboard with him and just made it the Doctor in 7 of 9 show at the expense of all the other characters. So anyway, point is, Voyager should have been serialized. And also, more specifically, they had an opportunity. There was the writers wanted to do an entire serialized season in season 4, much like the way Enterprise did it with season 3, which I think was amazing. They wanted to do that in season 4 with the Year of Hell, and have the Year of Hell actually last a year. But of course they were shot down, and they had to truncate it into just a 2-parter, which is my favorite 2-parter, and one of my favorite 2-parters in the entire show. So imagine how amazing it would have been if it was in the entire season. Anyway, the other example that I want to talk about is in fact Deep Space Nine. Even though Deep Space Nine, was the most serialized of these earlier shows, it could have been more so, and the best example of this is in season 7. Because they, in fact, the writers did want to do an entire serialized season in the same way, as I said, that Enterprise would do in season 3, but were overruled. Now, they were able to do a 10-episode arc at the end of the season, which I think is one of my favorite little chunks of storytelling in the entire Star Trek franchise. I thought it was absolutely amazing, but imagine how much better it would be if the entire season was like that and not just 10 episodes, because it has a lot of people like to point out it makes absolutely zero sense for them to have all these side quest episodes about, the crew playing baseball on the holodeck, or having a heist on the holodeck, or holosuites, if you will, it doesn't really matter. And, Ezri Dax having adventures with her sister, or like his murderer set loose in the station, or all the other bullshit that they did when there's a war going on. Like, a lot of people like to joke that they're all playing baseball in the holosuites when the Dominion shows up and blows up the station, because they're not paying attention to the fucking war. So all that should have been 86, and they should have just had a serialized story arc from the very beginning that followed. Instead of just 10 episodes, that should have had the entire season should have been a serialized story arc about the Dominion War. Star Trek shouldn't be episodic. It actually should be more serialized, and is always at its best when it is serialized. That is my stance. That's the hill I will die on again. So after I made this video, I realized I left a really stunning omission, and so I've recorded this, and I'm going to edit it in after the fact, so that's why I have different clothes on and whatnot, basically. And I'm putting it pretty much here at number 3. I know I just named my number 3, but I call this 3A, or a tie for number 3, because I didn't want to throw this at the top of the video and throw it an honorable mention. That's another option, but I thought, no, this is actually like way high. I can't believe I forgot it. I kind of had this feeling when I was making the list that I kind of went a bit quickly, that I might be leaving some things out. And this, I think, is quite an important one, as I said, a huge one that I ranted about on my channel before, and I think it does deserve to be all the way up at number 3. So, as I said, consider this a tie with the other one. And that is that the Klingon makeup change in Star Trek Discovery. And I guess it goes beyond just the makeup change. It's the whole way they presented the Klingons. They presented them very differently, like a different race, yet this is supposed to be Star Trek. This is supposed to be the same timeline. This is supposed to be, everything's supposed to be the same, yet not only do they look like orcs, but they act very differently. Like, they try to keep some of the culture the same. Like, they reference a lot of things that have been referenced, like characters, like core and whatnot are referenced a lot. But it still doesn't, like, quite add up. Plus, alright, main thing that bothers me is the way they pronounce Kahless. It's Kahless, not Kalish. Like, they go into season 2, like, Kalish. And they treat it more like a cult, not the way they used to treat Kahless, not fucking Kalish. Bullshit. Anyway, and so the makeup change is horrible. Now, there was pushback from that, from people saying, well, it's not the first time they've been a makeup change for Klingons. There's a makeup change from the original series to Next Generation in the movies. In the original series, they just looked like humans with little makeup on, but now they had our foreheads all of a sudden, so it's the same thing. No! It's not at all the same thing, and here's why. Because in the original series, the Klingons disappeared once or twice. They weren't really established, not really, as a main sort of staple of the Star Trek franchise until the movies and Next Generation, when they had the bumpy forehead. That is the classic Klingon. That has been established as Klingons, and plus, in the original series, they were just like, oh my dear Captain Kirk. Like, they weren't even Klingons. It wasn't until the movies in Next Generation where they really established their culture. They had the warrior culture, the honor system. It first introduced the Bird of Prey, which was a ship that was originally designed as a Romulan ship because they thought the Romulans would be the enemies in Star Trek 3, but they changed their minds the last second. It was the Klingons. Now it's classic Klingons, and they established the culture through Worf. The whole Klingon language is established there. Everything about Kahless, I guess, was brought up in the original series, but again, that was totally stupid and different. Help me, Spock, help. No, that's not Kahless. Maybe it's Kalish. Maybe that's who they're fucking talking about. I don't know. But anyway, point is, it was established with the movies and the Next Generation, and it was hardened, and it was set in stone in Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise. So for over a decade, over like a ridiculous amount of material, 4 shows. Was it 4? Yeah, 4 shows and many movies, all like hardened and established that this is how Klingons look, this is how Klingons talk, this is how Klingons act. So to drastically change that for no fucking reason, is, I'm sorry, completely and utterly, it could not possibly be more different than the makeup change from the Klingons from the original series to the movies. Because they weren't even established yet, and they did it for them better. There is an ingrained, established race. It's like if the Star Wars movie came out and had Darth Vader, and he looked totally fucking different, and he talked like, oh, hi, I'm Darth Vader! You know, it's not the same fucking thing! It's not how it's been established in the franchise. And for people to try to, oh, but it's just a makeup change they've done before. No! That's horseshit! No! The other thing I talked about is how in the first season of Discovery, they all are bald and they look like orcs. And in the second season of Discovery, they added hair to them and sort of softened their makeup a bit. So they looked a bit more like the classic Klingons. And they tried to come up with this in-universe horseshit excuse as to why they didn't have hair and now they did. It's like, well, you see, the Klingons, when they're at war, they shave their heads. So that's why they all shave their heads. It was a battle tactic. And now they're not at war, so now they grow hair again. Bullshit! Bullshit! How fucking stupid do think I am. That is the lamest excuse for an answer I have ever fucking heard of. First of all, never, as I said, the Klingons are not just an established race, probably the most, even more so than Vulcans. I'm going to say that definitely, because Vulcans barely appeared in Next Generation Deep Space Nine. Well, Voyager had Tuvok, but that's it. So Klingons are way more established of a race, particularly in Mountain Trek, than any other race. And never, ever have they mentioned that they shave their heads for battle. We've seen Klingons in battles many times. We've seen them at war. They were in the Dominion War. They were at war with the Federation. They were at war with the Romans, and never, ever did they fucking shave their heads. Now you could say, oh, maybe they just stopped that tradition in Next Generation times. Enterprise. And sometimes Next Gen or Deep Space Nine would reference the past. They had fucking hair. So that is a horseshit of an excuse, and I can't believe someone actually tried to argue that with me. I'm like, you can't fucking be serious. You're actually buying that load of crap? It's some makeup. They realize how horrible these Klingons look and how they were wholesale rejected by the fan base, and so, whoa, fuck, they look terrible. So we gotta fix this. Let's make them look more like traditional Klingons. We can not change it too drastically so it doesn't look like we're backpedaling. So just add hair and soften their features a bit. And if anyone asks why we added hair, we'll just say, oh, it's because they shaved their heads for war. I mean, it was suggested I gotta thank Norman Buckwell, Patreon supporter, because I previewed this video, and he's the one who pointed out to me I forgot to put this in there. I was like, oh my god, I did. And he also mentioned the another thing I could have put in my top 10, which I was tempted to, but I don't think I think I did consider this, but I didn't quite make my list. Was the fact where they retcon things and they try to come up with in-universe lame excuses for doing so, like the Enterprise episode that tried to excuse why the makeup change happened with the Klingons between the original series and Next Generation, which does not track at all. And Discovery's even worse with the Pike saying, "Oh, let's rip the holographic images out of the Enterprise," like that's supposed to explain why Starfleet hasn't had holographic images for centuries. But I do have to say that this whole BS excuse of, oh, they shaved their heads, is the worst. It is the laziest, lamest, weakest bullshit excuse where they should have just fucking admitted, alright, we fucked up. This new look for the Klingons is terrible. We'll fix it for you. But no, these producers, these writers are too fucking prideful to just admit when they fucked up. And to be fair, like, as I said, I don't hate Discovery whole cloth. There's some things I really like about it. There's some things I think they're really good at, and some things I think they succeed. There's some characters I do enjoy. But when they fuck up, they're just like, they should fucking admit that they fucked up. But anyway, let's get back to my pre-recorded. Alright, so now let me get into my number 2 second worst thing that the Star Trek franchise has ever done, and that is the creation of the Kelvin timeline. Now, I kind of differentiated from having the Kelvin films, the J.J. Abrams films, if you will, because I actually thought the Into Darkness was okay. It was a decent movie, and I actually really liked Beyond. Although part of the reason I really liked Beyond is because it didn't really have to take place in the Kelvin universe. It could have taken place in a prime timeline, and it would have been exactly the same. But I liked Into Darkness because that particularly played with the aspect of being a parallel universe and having different events that we know but happening in a different way. I can't stand Star Trek 2009. I think that's one of the worst movies ever. But here's the thing, and part of what bothers me about that movie, not the whole thing. It was just a really poorly written script where the plot's all over the place and the villain's two-dimensional. But part of what bothers me about it is the whole concept of the Kelvin timeline. So basically, and I talked about this in a different video I did about when I analyzed time travel in Star Trek, is that there's different kinds of thoughts of time travel. There's the whatever happened time travel, which I call type 1, and there's the you go back in time, you alter the timeline, and it's the one singular timeline, and it changes events. So if you want things to go back to the way they were, you have to travel back and fix it so you can restore the one singular timeline. Type 2 time travel, which in general, like there are some type 1 examples in Star Trek, but in general it's always type 2. That's basically the mode of time travel that Star Trek is using, and that's what most science fiction movies use. But this film, Star Trek 2009, decided to use type 3 time travel, which is if you go back in time and change something, it creates a different timeline. So you have basically another parallel universe that exists inside the original timeline. So they decided to call the original timeline the prime timeline, and this new timeline that was created by Nero going back in time, the Kelvin timeline, because it started with him destroying the Kelvin. And so, first of all, that's never the mode of time travel that Star Trek has ever used. So it goes against everything that's Star Trek. But the main issue I have with this whole idea, the whole creation of having this separate timeline, is that it's just a bullshit excuse for the writers to ignore canon, to ignore the Star Trek universe and be like, oh, we can do whatever the fuck we want with it. And what did they do with it? They did Into Darkness, which is just reinventing Wrath of Khan. And then they did Beyond, which, as I said, it didn't even have to be set in the Kelvin. It could have very easily taken place in the Prime. So they themselves saw it as unnecessary, but it was basically, to put it this way, it was a way of rebooting the franchise, of wiping the slate clean. And this is something that Brennan Berga and Ronald D. Moore suggested that maybe Star Trek should do in the First Contact commentary, which I watched. And when I heard that, I was appalled. I was like, that's the absolutely wrong thing you want to do with Star Trek. Because here's the thing, and this is something I can tell looking at the fan base as a whole, and this is something I feel really passionate about myself, is that part of the reason why we love Star Trek so much is because of the world building, because of the built up lore of all the different aliens and races and characters and situations and mythology that's baked into Star Trek. Now, to try to just erase that and wipe it clean, start again, why should I even bother watching it? Like, it's getting rid of everything that I love about Star Trek. That's why Deep Space Nine is my favorite show, because it delves deeper into this mythology, deeper into this world building, whereas the concept of a reboot kind of wipes everything clear. Now, this is what you would call a soft reboot, because they don't start particularly from scratch. They come up with this in-universe excuse, and as I say, which is inconsistent with how time travel has been portrayed in Star Trek, in order to excuse, so they don't completely wipe everything clean. They keep Enterprise, good for that, but they try to erase everything that comes after, and that's just a terrible idea. That's like that's just goes against everything that I like about Star Trek. It goes against everything a lot of fans like about Star Trek, and so when I hear people saying that Discovery shouldn't be set in the prime timeline, it angers me the whole hell, because the prime timeline is Star Trek. There is nothing else. This whole Kelvin thing is bullshit, and to continue doing this bullshit concept just is an excuse for bad writers to be lazy, basically. Oh, I don't want to look up the history and canon, so let's just be lazy and wipe everything clean. That's all that is. And so that's bullshit. I don't want any show, anything else. In fact, I would love it if in the future Star Trek films, they find a way to erase the Kelvin timeline. This whole concept is terrible, and it is one of the worst things the Star Trek franchise has ever done. So, now let me get into the number one worst thing the Star Trek franchise has ever done. Now, if you have any familiarity with my channel, you should know the answer, because I did mention this before as the worst thing the Star Trek franchise has ever done. And that is, get my singing voice ready. It's been a long time getting from there to here. The theme song of Star Trek Enterprise. Now, this is different than what I talked about before with Enterprise with the theme and setting, although it kind of goes along with it, because you get like the themes kind of why they came up with this terrible theme song. Now, I've gotten a lot of pushback from people that are wrong, that try to, and in fact some people are quite viciously defend this song. Well, I will defend this, that this is the worst thing the Star Trek franchise has ever done. I will fight this to my death. And let me get one thing straight. Even though I'm not a big fan of the song itself, it's not that the song is terrible, because to be fair, like, there's worse music out there, and music is a very subjective thing too. Like, if this song came up on the radio, I wouldn't be like, oh, my ears hurt, turn this off. I would just be like, yeah, whatever. I would just not even pay any attention, be like, whatever, it's fine. So it's not the song itself that's the issue. It's the fact that they made the song a theme of a Star Trek show. Which, alright, so first, Star Trek has always had the tradition of having orchestral themes, and really grand, like really great orchestral themes too, like Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, all had really good like orchestral themes in the movies. And in fact, like, I like the themes of Discovery and Picard and Lower Decks, and I had heard some people complain about when Discovery first came out. I was like, oh my god, that theme song is terrible. I'm like, after Enterprise, it's a fucking masterpiece. Because it's not what Star Trek is. But here's why I think it's the worst thing the Star Trek franchise has ever done, and because it stands out as the most obvious, most contrived, most ill-thought and just despicable attempt that the creators of this show made to try to make it more appealing to general audiences, which of course, and it's so, and it doesn't, of course. It's like, I compared it to the episode of The Simpsons where they came up with Poochie and are like, hey, let's what do we think of? A bunch of business executives in the office trying to think of what's cool and how to appeal to the cool kids. That's what this comes off as. Them now trying to appear. Oh, and it's part of why not including the title Star Trek in Enterprise is trying to like fool the general audiences. And of course, did it attract general audiences? No. What it did do is alienate the audience that it already had. In fact, and this is something I will fight tooth and nail about, that Discovery is actually better, because although it did alienate some of the audience that it already had, there's no argument about that, but it actually succeeded in drawing a new audience. It actually succeeded in appealing to a younger, more pop culture type audience, where Enterprise failed. The only thing it managed to do is alienate the existing audience that it already had. And having that theme song, and especially like some people say like, oh, but the theme song fits the theme of the show, and that's part of the problem. As I already talked about, theme of the show was number 5 on my list, and it does fit it, and that's part of the problem. But when the show got better in season 3 and 4, they should have 86 this song, because it no longer fit, because the show was now good. The show was no longer a cheesy attempt to appeal to general audiences. They should have fixed the theme song. Instead, they added a melody to it that made it worse. Which I will never get that. So this is definitely the most skippable intro as it all. Like, they have the Archers thing, which I don't think is great, because it has this cheesy guitar solo that reminds me of like 80s hair bands. But it's definitely way better than this. That, if anything, that should have been the theme song of Enterprise, and I wouldn't have complained. So even though, as I said, it wouldn't be my favorite theme song, I wouldn't complain about it. It would still feel natural. It would still fit into the pantheon of Star Trek, and it would be a bit more modern with that guitar solo and whatnot, but it wouldn't be so blaringly out of place and obvious ploy to try to draw in general audiences. And I remember when I saw the pilot episode of Enterprise for the very first time and this theme song came on, my mind was completely blown, and that's the exact moment I knew that I would not like this show. It is the absolute worst thing that the Star Trek franchise has ever done, period. Anyway, that's it for my video of the top 10 worst things the Star Trek franchise has ever done. As I said at the top of this video, this of course is all my opinion. I know people disagree with me and look at it in different ways, and so I would very much like to civilly hear any differing opinions in the comments. It would be interesting to hear. But anyway, thanks so much for watching this video, which turned out to be a lot longer than I intended, but that seems to happen with all my videos nowadays. So be it. Be sure to check out my channel for more Star Trek videos, and also I do other videos on other shows like The Expanse, Better Call Saul, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.